Alright guys and gals, it's time to put on our hard hats and talk about constructing effective sentences. The first two building blocks of constructing effective sentences are clauses. There are two types, independent and dependent. No, we're not talking about Santa Claus here. Independent clauses contain a subject and a verb, subject aka noun. They are a complete thought. That's the other major thing. An example, Jim studied in the sweet shop for his chemistry quiz. The subject, Jim. What did Jim do? He studied. The other type of clause is a dependent clause. A dependent clause contains a subject and a verb, just like an independent clause, but it is not a complete thought. It is a grandma moment. This is where we don't know what happens at the end. Example, when Jim studied in the sweet shop for his chemistry quiz, what? What happened then? We don't know because it's an incomplete thought. These are the two building blocks for your sentences. There are four types of sentences. Your four types of sentences are simple, compound, complex, and compound complex. Simple sentences, everyone should know how to write these. They have one independent clause, which means they've got a subject and a verb, and they're a complete thought, meaning they're not a fragment. An example, typhoons are similar to hurricanes. Typhoons is the subject, and remember, are is the verb. This is kind of like a single person. They're living on their own and they can support themselves. Compound sentences have two or more independent clauses. They're usually joined by a conjunction. We talked about those today. A semicolon, which is the dot with the comma under it, and a transitional word. Example, typhoons are similar to hurricanes. And we've got the comma and the conjunction word, but, and another independent clause, they tend to be stronger and larger. If we took out the comma and the conjunction word, but, these would be two complete independent thoughts and they would be two complete sentences. So this is a compound sentence. Think of this like a married couple. They're married and they work together, but if they were to go their separate ways, they would both be able to stand on their own 2 feet. The next type of sentence has one independent clause and one or more dependent clauses. Remember, dependent clauses have a subject and a verb, but is not a complete thought, which means it can't stand on its own 2 feet. An example, typhoons are violent tropical storms. That's a complete thought. It's your independent clause. That occur in the Western Pacific. That's the dependent clause. This could not stand on its own if we took it out. There is another way to write this, to put the dependent clause first. Occurring mostly in the Western Pacific. Again, it's almost identical. And we've got a comma here. Typhoons are violent tropical storms. Think of complex sentences like a single parent with a kid. The kid is dependent on the other clause to take care of it and help it stand on its own. The last type of sentence is a compound complex sentence. And if you guess that compound complex sentences are compound and complex, you're right. They contain two or more independent clauses and one or more dependent clauses. So your example, as typhoons gather intensity, that's dependent, that can't stand on its own. They move slowly westward, independent, and a comma and a conjunction, but their circular winds are very strong. That's also independent. Think of this like a married couple with a child. They're still working together, but they could stand on their own. But now they have something else to support that couldn't. Okay, Ms. McClellan, why do I care about sentence types? Well, that's a great question. We can take the simple sentences that we all write very easily and use various strategies to make our writing more sophisticated. One of them is coordination. Coordination is taking independent clauses and combining them to make compound sentences. Pattern number 1 for compound sentences. You have an independent clause, complete sentence, plus a comma and a fanboy, we talked about those earlier, plus another independent clause. Fanboys, reminder, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. So your example, I wanted to see the birds, comma, conjunction word, but my husband insisted we watch the fish instead. The second way of combining two independent clauses to make a compound sentence is you have your independent clause plus a semicolon plus another independent clause. Brief note, the two independent clauses have to be related. You can't just randomly join two independent clauses together that have nothing to do with each other. That doesn't make for good writing. Your example, Mary was tired after the game, semicolon. Her mother practically had to carry her to bed. You see how those two are related? If this second one was unrelated, this would not be correct. And the last one for compound sentence, for coordination. Independent clause plus a semicolon, again, plus a transitional word, plus a comma, plus an independent clause. These are super fancy. Your transitional words, I want you to write down 3. Yes, only 3. I want you to try to use those 3 this week when we're looking at grammar. An example of the way this works. She excelled at sports, semicolon, conjunction word, however, her brother was much more inclined to play video games. The other strategy is called subordination, which is combining sentences using dependent clauses and independent clauses. You can make an independent clause dependent by using one of these words. These are called subordinating conjunctions. They make whatever phrase you've got, whatever clause you've got, dependent. Again, I want you to write down 3 of these. So if we start off with Harry Potter went to Hogwarts, but we throw one of these words in front of it, it's no longer an independent clause. If we say when Harry Potter went to Hogwarts, we don't know what we're talking about anymore. What happens when he goes to Hogwarts? So when you use these words, you've just made something a dependent clause. An example of this, John fell. That is a simple sentence. It's a complete independent clause. Then we throw in our subordinating conjunction, after John fell. This is no longer a sentence. It leaves the reader hanging. What happens after John falls? Does he bust his head open on the concrete and do his brains explode all over the field? We don't know. So we have to tell him. After John fell, comma, we had to cancel the game. This is now our independent clause, and this is our dependent clause. Now it's a complex sentence. General rule when you're using dependent clauses. If the fragment, or dependent clause, is the leader, the comma makes it sweeter. So if the dependent clause is first, you have to join it with a comma. So if there's a dependent clause at the beginning, after John fell, you have to join the two together with a comma. So after John fell, comma, we had to cancel the game. If the dependent clause comes after the independent clause, then you don't use a comma. You don't have to. We had to cancel the game. That's our independent clause after John fell. That's our same dependent clause. But because we're not using a comma, that makes this harder to identify as a complex sentence. So we got to watch that and make sure that we are looking for these things in our assignments, and also we need to make sure that we're doing this in our writing. You don't need a comma here. That's called a comma splice, and that's bad. All right, you've got your assignment, you've got the paragraph, you have to identify the sentence types, and you've got 2 sentences that I want you to combine about combat juggling. Yes, that's a thing. So combat juggling, there are 2 sentences about it. I want you to combine those, once using coordination and once using subordination. Good luck. See you tomorrow.